I guess if you're gonna tell a story about how everything went sideways, you gotta start in the middle of nowhere. For me, that middle of nowhere was a cabin made of rough-hewn pine logs perched on the edge of the Bitterroot National Forest, high up where the air bites you even in July. The year was 2014 when I walked away. Not a slow drift, mind you, but a clean break. I sold everything that wouldn't fit in the bed of my old Ford pickup, bought 40 acres of land nobody else wanted, steep, rocky, and miles from the nearest paved road, and just vanished. I'm Caleb, by the way. And trust me when I tell you, the name doesn't matter much when the only things calling it are the wind and the occasional confused elk. People talk about peace and quiet. This wasn't peace, this was emptiness. A kind of silence so deep it felt like the world had just forgotten how to make sound. That suited me fine, because I was trying to forget how to listen. See, I came from a life that was supposed to be straightforward. Good job, good reputation, a house with a lawn you had to mow every Saturday in the suburbs of Spokane. I was the guy you called when you needed help moving a couch, the one who always showed up. Then came the fire. Not a forest fire, but a financial one. A partnership that went south, an audit that was rigged from the start, and suddenly, I was the scapegoat. The fall guy. The one they all needed to point at so they could sleep at night. The details? They don't matter much now except to say that when the smoke cleared, I was the one left holding the bag. Friends, family, even the folks I drank coffee with every morning at the diner. They looked at me like I was poison. They believed the lie. They saw the headlines that painted me as a thief, a cheat, a man who'd betrayed trust. And when the whole world turns its back on you, when you realize that every handshake and every smile was conditional, you learn real fast that concrete and streetlights don't offer much comfort. So, I traded them for rock and timber. The cabin wasn't much when I started. Just 4 walls and a leaky roof. It took me 2 years of grinding, back-breaking labor just to make it weatherproof. I learned things out there that they don't teach you in any college. How to split wood without splitting your thumb. How to read the clouds for snow. How to tell the difference between a grizzly track and a black bear track, and which berries will kill you dead. My days were simple, brutal, and honest. They had to be. Up before the sun, hauling water from the creek, tending the small garden I'd managed to coax out of the rocky soil, and always chopping wood. Wood was life. In the Bitterroots, if you didn't have a good stack of firewood, you were dead by Thanksgiving. I didn't miss people. I missed the idea of people. I missed the comfort of shared laughter, maybe. But the actual human interaction, the judging glances, the whispered accusations, the way people crossed the street just to avoid having to look me in the eye? I was done with all that noise. The forest doesn't judge, it just demands. It demands sweat, strength, and respect. And if you give it those things, it lets you live. It was late October when the first real cold snap hit. We were talking about snow measured in feet, not inches. It came down hard and fast, a white curtain dropping over the whole world. I'd been hunkered down for 3 days, listening to the wind howl like 1,000 lost souls trying to claw their way through the chimney pipe. I was low on kerosene and getting twitchy. On the 4th morning, the wind died. The silence that followed was even heavier than the storm. I pulled on my thermal gear, laced up my heavy boots, and stepped outside. The world was blinding. Everything was covered in a pristine, deep blanket of white. It was beautiful, sure, but it was also deadly. Every step was a risk, every sound amplified. I needed to check my supply cache, about a quarter mile up the ridge, where I kept emergency rations and extra ammo. As I started breaking trail through the hip-high powder, I noticed something immediately. Tracks. Not deer, not elk, not even the clumsy wide prints of a hungry moose. These were long, purposeful, and unmistakable. They were the prints of a wolf pack. Now, wolves had always been around. This was their country. But they usually kept their distance from the cabin. They knew my scent, they knew the smell of the smoke, and they preferred the deep wilderness. These tracks, however, were fresh, laid down right after the heaviest snow, and they weren't skirting the perimeter. They led right past my garden plot, heading down toward the frozen creek bed. I stopped, hand resting on the rifle slung across my back. Wolves are magnificent creatures truly, but they are competition. They are masters of the hunt, and when the snow is this deep, they get bold. A starving pack is the most dangerous thing in the woods, even more so than a hungry bear. I followed the tracks cautiously, keeping my eyes moving. There were at least 5 or 6 distinct sets of prints. They moved with an efficiency that was terrifying. No wasted motion, just pure predatory purpose. They led me to a small clearing, sheltered by a stand of Douglas firs. And that's where I found the mess. It wasn't a kill site exactly, not yet. It was a confrontation. The snow was churned up, stained dark in several spots, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. There were wolf tracks everywhere, but mixed in with them were the massive, splayed prints of a full-grown mountain lion. A lion and a pack of wolves battling it out? That was rare. Usually they avoided each other. The lion is a solitary killer. The wolves rely on teamwork. But in a brutal winter, all the rules break down. I approached, slowly, rifle raised. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I wasn't going to walk into an ambush either. I saw tufts of black fur caught on the low branches of a spruce, wolf fur. And then, a few yards further, I saw the cat. It was huge, easily 200 pounds of muscle and rage, but it was dead. Its throat had been ripped open, and its flank looked like it had been shredded by razor wire. The wolves had won, but they hadn't stayed for the meal. They had dragged the lion far enough away from the immediate danger, maybe, but then they had scattered. I followed the trail of the pack, which now looked ragged and disorganized. They were hurt. I could see where one of them had been dragging a paw, leaving a faint, smeary trail of red across the white. This was the moment, I guess, that the world started to shift for me. Before, the animals were just part of the landscape, things to avoid, things to hunt, or things to ignore. But seeing that bloody battlefield, seeing the sheer desperate effort it took for them to survive, it resonated with the bitterness I felt inside. Survival out here wasn't pretty, it was just necessary. I kept following the tracks, not because I intended to track them down, but because the curiosity was a physical itch. I wanted to see the end of their story. The main pack seemed to head northeast, toward the deeper canyons, leaving the injured one's track to veer off sharply toward the west, toward the steep, rocky cliffs that overlooked the valley. This particular set of tracks was smaller than the others, and the drag mark was more pronounced. This animal was severely wounded, maybe dying. It was alone. I tracked it for another hour, moving slowly through the dense woods. The light was starting to fade, turning the snow a cold, deep blue. I knew I should turn back. Getting caught out after dark in this cold was a recipe for disaster. But something held me there. Maybe it was the knowledge that this creature, just like me, was trying to outrun a mortal wound, both physical and metaphorical. The tracks led me right up to a small cave entrance, barely big enough for a man to crawl into, hidden beneath a massive slab of granite. The snow around the entrance was undisturbed, except for the single set of tracks leading in. The wolf had found shelter. I knelt down, resting my rifle in the snow. I hesitated. Going into a tight space with a wounded wild animal, especially a wolf, is the definition of stupidity. But I didn't move. I just listened. I heard the shallow, ragged breathing from inside the cave. It was struggling. Every inhale sounded like sandpaper on wood. "Hey," I whispered, my voice rough from disuse. "I ain't gonna hurt you." Silence. Just the breathing. I knew what the outcome should be. The wolf was a predator, too wounded to hunt, and it would eventually die, or maybe it would wander into my traps in a desperate attempt to eat. Nature takes its course. That's what I kept telling myself. But the world had turned its back on me. And here, in the cold, deep heart of the Montana wilderness, was a creature that was experiencing that same isolation, that same abandonment. The pack had left it. They had to. Weakness is a luxury the wilderness cannot afford. I pulled off my heavy leather glove and touched the cold granite near the entrance. The stone was radiating cold. I thought about the warmth of my wood stove, the meager comfort of my bedroll, and the 3-day journey it would take to get to a veterinary clinic. A clinic that would probably just put a bullet in the animal anyway. This was my turning point. Before this moment, I was just surviving. Now I felt a pull, a strange sense of kinship with the broken thing breathing raggedly in the darkness. I couldn't just leave it. Not because I was a good Samaritan. I hadn't been that man in years, but because if I left it, I felt like I was leaving myself, the last flicker of decency that hadn't been stamped out by betrayal and bitterness. I backed away slowly, marking the spot carefully in my mind. I needed supplies. I needed light, and I needed a plan that didn't involve getting my arm chewed off. I raced back to the cabin, the adrenaline overriding the fatigue. I threw open the door, startling the small field mouse that had taken up residence near the hearth. I grabbed the lantern, a roll of thick canvas, the last of my antiseptic, meant for my own cuts and scrapes, and a coil of rope. I even grabbed a piece of the smoked venison I'd been saving. "We're going back out," I muttered to the empty room. Don't ask me why. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple that faded quickly to the steel gray of twilight. The temperature was dropping fast, too. The cold was now a physical weight pressing down on my chest. When I got back to the cave, the breathing was weaker, more shallow. I lit the lantern and held it low, peering into the blackness. The air was thick with the smell of pine, cold earth, and iron. "I'm coming in," I announced, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Just stay put, all right? No sudden moves?" I squeezed into the opening, dragging the canvas behind me. The cave was small, maybe 8 feet deep. In the glow of the lantern, I saw him. It was a male, a massive specimen, even larger than the average timber wolf, with deep black fur that looked like polished obsidian. He was lying, curled tight against the back wall, his head resting heavily on his forepaws. He lifted his head slowly when the light hit him, and his eyes, amber and ancient, fixed on me. They weren't the eyes of a beast panicked by pain. They were the eyes of something infinitely tired, something that had accepted its fate. He didn't growl. He didn't even bare his teeth. He just watched me, breathing in short, painful gasps. The wound was obvious. His left rear leg was angled wrong, definitely broken, and there was a deep, ragged gash running across his flank, probably where the mountain lion's claws had raked him. The blood had frozen, gluing the fur together, but the wound was deep and festering. Infection had set in. He was running a fever, I could tell just by the way he radiated heat in the frigid cave. I sat back on my heels, several feet away, letting the light shine on the venison I placed gently in the snow. "That's for you," I said softly. "It's good meat. You need your strength." He didn't move toward the food. He just kept those intense amber eyes locked on mine. In that moment, staring into the face of a creature that should have been my enemy, I saw a reflection of my own despair. He was alone, broken, and waiting for the end. Just like I had been, sitting alone in my cabin, waiting for the world to forget me entirely. I knew then that saving this wolf wasn't about charity. It was about saving a piece of myself. It was about proving that even when the world abandons you, you don't have to become the monster they said you were. "All right," I whispered, pulling the canvas sheet closer. "This is going to hurt, friend, but we gotta fix this." The first step was the hardest. getting close enough to touch him without getting my throat torn out. I moved slowly, talking to him constantly, my voice low and soothing, telling him about the fire, about the lies, about the cold comfort of the high mountains. I was talking to the wolf, but I was really talking to the emptiness inside me. I dipped a piece of the venison into the small pool of melted snow from the lantern heat and held it out. He watched my hand. It took a full 5 minutes. 5 minutes were the only. Sound was the drip of melting snow and his labored breathing, before he finally shifted his weight and took the meat, gently, almost politely, from my fingers. That small act, that tiny flicker of trust from a creature that had every reason to fear me, was the first real connection I'd made in years. The world had turned its back, sure, but maybe, just maybe, the world of the wild hadn't. I spent the next hour cleaning his wounds. He winced, he tensed, but he never snapped. He let me pour the stinging antiseptic over the deep gashes, and he endured the painful, careful work of splinting his broken leg with rough pieces of wood from my supply bag, wrapped tight in canvas strips. He was heavy, impossibly strong even in his weakened state, and the work left me shaking and sweating in the freezing air. When I was done, I pulled back, exhausted. The wolf, now resting easier with the support on his leg, looked up at me again. This time, there was something different in his eyes. Not gratitude, wolves don't do gratitude, but recognition. I knew I couldn't leave him here. He was stabilized, but he needed warmth, food, and constant care for weeks, maybe months. If I left him in the cave, the cold would finish him, or the rest of the pack, sensing weakness, might return. "Come on," I said, pulling the heavy canvas under him like a makeshift sled. "We're going home, you and me." The drag back to the cabin was brutal. Every few steps I had to stop, leaning against a tree trunk, lungs burning in the icy air. But I didn't stop for long. I had a purpose now, a reason to push through the cold and the exhaustion. I wasn't just surviving for myself anymore. By the time we reached the cabin door, the moon was high, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. I managed to get the ducker open and drag the heavy canvas and the wolf inside, right next to the roaring heat of the wood stove. I stoked the fire high and dropped down onto the floor beside him, utterly spent. The wolf looked around the cabin, his eyes taking in the rough walls, the scattered tools, the familiar scent of pine smoke and stale coffee. He was in enemy territory, the domain of the two-legged creature, but he was warm, and he was safe. I lay down on my thin mattress, pulling my blanket up to my chin. I watched the wolf breathe, slow and deep now, the pain easing slightly. I was no longer alone. The silence in the cabin was still deep, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. I closed my eyes, listening to the rhythmic thump-thump of his tail, just once against the wooden floor. I didn't know what kind of trouble I had just invited into my life, but for the first time since I'd fled the city, I felt like I had made the right choice. The world had turned its back on Caleb, the man, but the wilderness had given Caleb, the broken soul, a companion. And that was how it started. That was how the wolf came to stay. I woke up to the smell of wood smoke and dried blood. It was still dark. The fire was dying down, just glowing embers in the stove, but the little cabin was holding the heat. I lay there for a minute, completely still, trying to figure out what was wrong. Then the memory hit me like a blast of cold air. I had a wild wolf sleeping 5 feet from my head. I eased myself up onto an elbow, trying not to make the old springs in the mattress squeak. He was still there, a massive black shape curled up tight on the canvas tarp, his breathing deep and even, thank God. The splint I'd rigged up on his back leg looked solid. My first thought was pure, unadulterated fear. What in the hell had I done? This wasn't a stray dog. This was a top-tier predator, a killing machine built of muscle and teeth, capable of tearing me apart before I could even reach for the hatchet I kept under the bed. The exhaustion from the night before had let me play the hero, but the cold light of morning brought reality crashing down. I stared at him for a long time. His head was resting low, but his ears were twitching, tracking every sound I didn't even know I was making. He knew I was awake. I slowly swung my legs over the side of the bed. My knees cracked like dried twigs in the silence. The wolf's eyes opened. They were the same deep, burning amber as before. But this morning, they weren't tired. They were assessing. I kept my movements slow and predictable. I needed coffee. I needed to stoke the fire. And most importantly, I needed to figure out how to keep a 200-pound wild animal alive in my living room without becoming his first meal. I scooped water into the kettle and placed it on the stove. The wolf watched the whole process. I avoided direct eye contact, which is the universal sign of aggression in the wild, but I kept talking, my voice low and steady. "Morning, partner," I said, stirring the embers. "Rough night, huh? Well, the good news is you're warm. The bad news is you're stuck here, with me." He didn't make a sound. No growl, no whimper, just those eyes. The first few days were a tightrope walk. Every time I had to move, to grab firewood, to step outside for a few minutes, or just to refill my coffee cup, I felt the tension radiating off him. He was wounded and cornered, the two most dangerous states for any wild creature. I realized quickly that I couldn't just leave him alone. Not only did he need the warmth and the wound, care, but he needed to realize that I wasn't a threat. So I spent those days mostly sitting on the floor, reading an old dog-eared copy of a Zane Grey Western, occasionally looking up and just letting him see me, existing in his space. The hardest part was the feeding and the cleaning. I had to hunt. Hunting for myself was one thing. A deer usually lasted me a month. Hunting for a massive, recovering wolf meant I needed fresh meat constantly. The deep snow made tracking brutal, but the adrenaline of knowing I had another mouth to feed, another life depending on me, actually sharpened my focus. I managed to drop a small buck on the second day, hauling the carcass back through the snow with pure, desperate grit. I brought the meat back and placed it near the stove, far enough away from the wolf that he wouldn't feel threatened, but close enough to smell. He didn't touch it immediately. He was still in shock, running a fever, and probably worried I'd poisoned it. It took me 3 days before he finally ate a substantial amount. I was sitting on my bed, pretending to be absorbed in the book, when I heard the low, tearing sound of muscle being ripped from bone. It wasn't aggressive, just the sound of pure necessity. When I looked up, he was devouring the meat with a focused intensity that was mesmerizing. That was the first tiny shift. He was accepting my provision. I never gave him a formal name. It felt wrong, like trying to put a leash on the Rocky Mountains. Sometimes, when I talked to him, I called him the Shadow, because his fur was so black it seemed to absorb the light, and he moved with a silent, heavy presence, even when injured. But mostly, he was just the wolf. The wound care was awful. That infection in his flank was nasty. I had to change the bandages daily, which meant getting right up close, cutting away the frozen, matted fur, and cleaning the deep, angry gash. The first time I tried to touch the wound, he let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards. It was a sound that warned of immediate violence. I froze, my hand hovering 6 inches above his flank. "Easy, friend," I murmured, my heart doing a desperate samba in my chest. "This is gonna hurt, but we gotta get the bad stuff out. You'll die if we don't." I backed off, waited 10 minutes, and tried again. This time, I moved even slower, scratching him lightly behind the ears, a spot I'd noticed he kept trying to rub against the floor. He tensed, but he didn't growl. I moved my hand down his neck, past his massive shoulders, and carefully, gently, I laid my hand flat on his back. He tolerated it. He kept his eyes shut, enduring it. That was my opening. I worked quickly, cutting the bandages and cleaning the wound with hot water and the last of my iodine. The smell was terrible. The pain was clearly immense. At one point, he snapped his head around, his teeth flashing an inch from my face, and let out a sharp, surprised yelp of pain. I didn't flinch. I just held his gaze. I know it hurts. I'm almost done. I think that was the true turning point. He saw the pain in my eyes, the sympathetic pain, maybe, or maybe just the sheer terror of being that close to his teeth. And he understood that I was there to help, not to harm. He lowered his head and let me finish. The days blurred into weeks. The winter outside was relentless, a constant hammering of snow and wind. We were locked in. The trails were impassable, and the nearest town might as well have been on the moon. It was just the two of us, surviving on venison, stale coffee, and the heat of the wood stove. The routine saved me. Before the wolf, my days were about self-preservation, a grim, lonely chore. Now they had structure. Wake up, check the fire, check the wolf's fever, change the bandage, feed him, feed myself, hunt, chop wood. My focus shifted entirely away from the bitterness and the injustice of my past life and onto the immediate, tangible reality of keeping this magnificent creature alive. I started talking to him constantly. Not just the soft whispers when I was tending his injuries, but real conversation. You know, I'd say, leaning back against the wall while he chewed on a bone, they called me a crook, said I stole millions. Funny thing is, I lived in a house with a mortgage and drove a 10-year-old truck. Where'd all that money go, huh? They didn't care about the truth. They just needed a villain for the headlines. The wolf would just chew, sometimes looking up, sometimes letting out a soft, low sigh that sounded almost human. He was the best listener I'd ever had. He never judged. He never interrupted. He never offered advice. He just was. And slowly, I started to heal too. The wound inside me, the festering gash of betrayal, began to scab over. When you are focused entirely on saving another life, you don't have the energy to wallow in self-pity. The bitterness was still there, sure, but it was pushed to the background, replaced by the immediate demands of the present. Around the 4th week, the wolf was clearly much stronger. His fever broke, the wound on his flank was closing cleanly, and his amber eyes were bright with renewed life. He started trying to get up more often, testing the splint, which was starting to drive him crazy. One afternoon, I was leaning over the stove, stirring a pot of beans, when he finally made his move. He shifted his weight too fast, lost his balance, and the splinted leg scraped loudly against the wooden floor. He let out a sharp, frustrated whine and tried to stand on 3 legs, but his strength failed him, and he slammed back down onto the canvas. I rushed over, instinctively reaching out to steady him. That was a mistake. In a flash, the wild animal took over. He wasn't thinking. He was reacting. His lips curled back in a silent snarl, revealing teeth that were terrifyingly long and white, and he lunged his head toward my arm. I didn't pull back. I couldn't. I just stood there, my hand resting on his shoulder, looking straight into those fierce, wild eyes. His teeth closed, not on my flesh, but in the air just inches from my sleeve. He held the snarl for a frozen moment, the primal instinct demanding the attack, and then, slowly, the rage drained out of him. He relaxed his jaw, let out a shaky breath, and lowered his head back onto his paws. The silence in the cabin was deafening. I could feel the cold sweat running down my back. I knew I had just passed a test. I had shown him that even when he was scared and in pain, I wouldn't retreat. I sank down beside him, completely drained. "See?" I whispered, rubbing his head gently. "We're in this together. No need for that noise." He pushed his heavy head against my leg, a massive, comforting weight, and let out a low, soft exhale that was the closest thing I'd ever heard to an apology. From that day on, the relationship changed completely. The fear didn't vanish. You never completely lose the awareness that you share space with something utterly wild, but it was replaced by a deep mutual respect. He still watched me, but now it was with curiosity and patience, not suspicion. He started doing things that were almost domestic. When I was out chopping wood, I'd leave the cabin door ajar so he could breathe the cold, fresh air. Sometimes when I came back, he'd have shifted himself so he was looking out the doorway, tracking my movements. And if I was gone too long, I'd hear a low, impatient huff from inside, demanding my return. We learned to communicate without words. A flick of his ear meant he was uncomfortable. A thump of his tail, which became a regular, soft rhythm against the wood floor, meant I was doing something right. He had his territory, the canvas next to the stove, and I had mine. We were two broken creatures sharing a refuge. As January deepened, the cold became monstrous. The temperature dropped so low that the creek froze solid right down to the bedrock, and the air hurt to breathe. Food became scarce. The deer had moved down to lower elevations, and I was forced to rely on my dwindling store of dried beans and salt pork. I needed to hunt, but a blizzard was raging outside, making travel impossible and visibility zero. We were confined for 5 days straight. I rationed the food carefully, giving the wolf slightly more than myself, knowing his recovery depended on protein. I was starting to feel the hunger pains, the dull, constant ache in my stomach. On the 6th day, the snow stopped. The world was still and impossibly cold, but the sky was clear, a sharp, brilliant blue. "All right, Shadow," I said, pulling on my heavy parka and checking the action on my rifle. "Time to go to work. We need something big." I stepped outside, sinking immediately into drifts that were chest-high in some spots. The wolf whined softly from the cabin, clearly wanting to follow, but his leg wasn't ready. I spent the next 8 hours tracking, freezing my fingers and fighting through the snow. Nothing. The woods were empty. The cold had driven everything deep into cover. I was exhausted, disappointed, and worried. Going back empty-handed meant going hungry for another day, and the wolf needed to keep gaining weight. As I struggled back toward the ridge defeated, I noticed something odd. A set of tracks, very large, very fresh, moving toward my cabin. My stomach dropped. Not wolf tracks this time, but human tracks. Snowmobiles, maybe, or heavy boots. Someone had broken trail, and they were heading straight for my isolated sanctuary. Panic seized me. My whole reason for being out here was to escape people, to escape the judgment, the lies, the risk of being recognized. Who was it? A lost hiker, or someone looking for me? The papers had long stopped covering my scandal, but the memory was long among the people who counted. I dropped into a crouch behind a thick stand of pines, my rifle ready. I watched the direction of the tracks, my breath fogging violently in the sub-zero air. The tracks led directly to my cabin, and then I heard it. A voice, muffled by the distance but definitely human. "Hello? Anyone home?" We saw smoke. It was a man's voice, booming and friendly. Too friendly. I stayed low, heart pounding. I couldn't let them see the cabin. If they saw the wolf inside, they would report it. And in Montana, a wild predator being kept in a remote cabin, especially by a man with my reputation, would bring the full force of the game wardens down on me. They'd take him, maybe kill him, and haul me back to civilization. I had to intercept them. I started moving fast through the deep snow, cutting a wide arc to come up behind them. I moved with a stealth I hadn't known I possessed, fueled by the desperate need to protect the life I had built here, the life that now included the wolf. When I finally caught sight of them, I stopped dead. There were 2 of them, a man and a woman, dressed in bright, expensive winter gear carrying high-end camera equipment. Tourists, probably from California or Seattle, looking for a picturesque view of the Bitterroots. They looked totally out of place, like exotic birds in a field of gray granite. They were standing right outside my front door, the man knocking loudly. "Seriously, honey, someone's got to be here. Look at that smoke. And what is that smell?" the man said, wrinkling his nose. The woman pointed toward the window. "Look, tracks, really big paw prints leading right up to the door. Maybe they have a huge dog." I took a deep breath, trying to slow my racing heart. I raised the rifle, aiming it just above their heads, into the snow-laden branches of a nearby fir. Crack! The shot echoed through the valley like a cannon blast. Snow rained down from the startled branches. The two tourists screamed, jumping a mile in the air, spinning around to face the source of the noise. "Get out!" I roared, my voice raw and loud, amplified by the cold, dense air. "This is private property. Get off my land now." They couldn't see me clearly, just a shape in the dense woods, the barrel of a rifle glinting in the pale afternoon light. The man threw his hands up instantly. Whoa, we didn't mean any harm. We're lost. We just saw the smoke." "I don't care what you saw," I yelled back, keeping the tone menacing. "Turn around and head back the way you came. And if I ever see your faces on this land again, I won't shoot over your heads." They didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled back, dropping a lens cap in their haste, and started plunging through the snow, heading back down the trail they had broken. They were terrified. Good. I stood there until the sound of their frantic, heavy breathing faded completely into the silence. My own hands were shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline. I had just threatened 2 innocent people with a firearm. The old Caleb would have been horrified. The new Caleb just felt relief. I waited another 10 minutes, just listening, making sure they were gone. Then, I lowered the rifle and walked slowly back to the cabin. I kicked the door shut behind me and leaned against the frame, trying to catch my breath. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. I looked over at the canvas tarp. The wolf was sitting up, alert, his ears pricked forward. He hadn't just been tracking my movements. He had been listening to the whole confrontation. He heard the strangers, he heard the gunshot, and he heard the fury in my voice. He looked at me, tilting his massive head slightly. I walked over to the stove and started making coffee, my movements still jerky from the shock. "See that, partner?" I muttered, pouring the scalding water. "That's why we stay hidden. People are trouble." I glanced back at him. He didn't move. He just stared. And then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted his head and let out a single, low, soft howl. It wasn't a mournful sound or a territorial challenge. It was a communication. It was the sound of a creature acknowledging the danger had passed and acknowledging the protector. I sat down on the floor, resting my back against the warm metal of the stove. I had failed to hunt, but I had successfully defended our space. I had chosen the wolf over the outside world, without a second thought. "I know," I sighed, running a hand through my messy hair. "We still need food." The wolf pushed himself up onto 3 legs, testing his weight. He took a hesitant step toward the door, then stopped, looking back at me. His eyes were urging me to follow. I knew he couldn't hunt. His leg was still too fragile, but he was communicating something crucial. I stood up, grabbing my heavy leather gloves and the rifle again. "All right," I said, a faint smile touching my lips for the first time in months. "Show me then." I followed him out the door. He moved slowly, painfully but with purpose, hobbling a few yards down the trail I had cleared earlier toward the north-facing slope where the shadows were deepest. He stopped at the edge of the woods and looked back at me, then up the slope, then back at me again. It took me a moment to realize what he was doing. He wasn't leading me to game. He was showing me where the game wasn't. The wolf knew the deer were long gone from the valley floor, but he also knew the paths of the smaller, tougher animals that relied on the sheltered high ground during blizzards: the snowshoe hares, the ptarmigan, and the occasional winter-hardy coyote. He was using his knowledge of the territory, his millennia of instinct, to guide my hunt. He was directing me to the hidden pockets of life that only a native predator would know. I looked at the dense, frozen thicket he was indicating. It was an impossible place to track, but it was sheltered from the wind. "Okay," I said, adjusting the rifle sling. "I trust you." I left the wolf resting near the cabin and plunged into the thicket, following his silent direction. I worked for hours, moving slower and more carefully than before, paying attention not to tracks, but to the subtle signs of broken twigs and sheltered warmth. And there, tucked deep beneath an overhang of granite and pine boughs, I found a small herd of 5 snowshoe hares huddled together against the cold. They were too focused on survival to notice my approach. It wasn't a deer, but it was fresh meat. It was enough. I made the kill clean and quick, bagging 3 of the hares. As I hauled them back to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, purple shadows across the bitter roots. When I got back, the wolf was waiting, his head lifted, sniffing the air. I dropped the haul onto the canvas. He didn't move to eat. He looked at me, then at the hares, and then he let out that soft, low thump of his tail against the floor. It was a perfect exchange. I provided the strength, and he provided the knowledge. We were a team. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind started to howl again, I ate my share of the tough, lean hare meat, and the wolf ate his. I sat there, watching him, no longer, feeling the crushing weight of isolation. The world had turned its back on Caleb, the scapegoat, but the wilderness had given Caleb, the survivor, a partner. And in the deep, cold silence of the Montana winter, that partnership was becoming the only thing that mattered. We were starting to learn how to rely on each other, 2 outcasts against the cold, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that neither of us was going back to the way things were. Not ever. The next few weeks were a study in patience and raw animal strength. When you're living with a wild creature, you learn the difference between healing and recovering. Healing is the wound closing up. Recovering is the return of the fight, the coiled readiness that makes a wolf a wolf. The wolf recovered like a force of nature. Every day the fever diminished, the color in his eyes brightened, and the muscle beneath that thick black coat hardened again. I kept him fed, keeping the venison coming, even if it meant risking frostbite to drag a carcass back through the woods. He repaid me by just existing, by filling the empty space in that cabin with a quiet, undeniable presence. The big moment came in early February. Time to take the splint off. The leg was mended, I could tell. He was putting tentative weight on it, and the stiffness was gone. But breaking a bone is one thing. Cutting off the canvas strips and wooden supports that had been his lifeline for a month was another. It was the last physical link of his dependency on me. I stoked the fire until the cabin was almost too hot, and I sat down on the floor, cross-legged with my heavy hunting knife. The wolf watched me, sensing the change in the routine. "Time for your freedom papers, partner," I whispered, keeping my voice light, even though my hands were sweating. I worked slowly, cutting through the layers of thick, bloody canvas tape. He tensed up immediately, the low, familiar rumble starting deep in his chest. I kept talking, telling him about the spring runoff, about the elk herds that would be moving back up the valley soon, trying to distract him from the vulnerability of the moment. When the last piece of the splint fell away, the leg looked pale and thin, but straight. He didn't move it for a long minute. He just lay there, breathing shallowly, waiting. Then, slowly, he pushed himself up. He stood on all 4 legs. He was magnificent. Even stiff from weeks of confinement, he was taller than I'd remembered, a towering silhouette of black fur and muscle. He took a single, careful step, then another, testing the weight. The leg held. He didn't look at me for approval. He looked at the door. That was the moment I'd been dreading. He was healed. He was free. He could leave, and why wouldn't he? The wilderness was his home, and I was just the caretaker who'd gotten him through a rough patch. I braced myself for the goodbye. I knew it wouldn't be sentimental. It would just be a flicker of movement, a quick exit, and then the return to the empty silence of the cabin. I was ready for the loneliness to rush back in. I stood up and opened the cabin door. The cold air rushed in, smelling of pine and clean snow. "Go on," I said softly, stepping aside. "You earned it, Shadow. Go find your pack." The wolf stood in the doorway, the snow crusting on the logs just inches from his nose. He sniffed the air, taking in the world he'd been denied for so long. He stood there for a full minute, silhouetted against the blinding white landscape. And then he turned around. He walked past me. His gait still, stiff but strong, circled the wood stove once and lay back down exactly on the canvas tarp. He curled up, rested his chin on his paws, and let out a deep, contented sigh. He didn't leave. He chose the warmth, the safety, and the company. He chose me. I closed the door, my chest feeling suddenly tight. It wasn't just relief. It was something profound. The world outside had rejected me, but this creature, this symbol of absolute wild freedom, had chosen my side of the wall. From that day on, the relationship shifted from patient caretaker to true partnership. The cabin was still his refuge, the place he returned to when the weather turned fierce, but he started venturing out with me. Not on a leash, obviously. That would have been insulting to us both, but simply as a companion. I learned quickly that when you walk the Bitterroots with a fully recovered wolf, you don't walk alone. We developed a routine. I'd grab the rifle and the hatchet, and he would wait patiently by the door. Once outside, he moved like liquid shadow, silent and fast, never wasting a step. I couldn't keep up with his speed, but I didn't have to. He was my scout, my eyes, and my ears. I would move slowly, tracking, following the signs of deer or elk, but the wolf always knew better. He would drift ahead, stop suddenly, and look back at me. A tiny flick of his ear or a shift in his posture telling me everything I needed to know. If the game was too far or too fast, he'd give a low, impatient huff and head in a different direction. If the path was clear, he'd just melt into the trees, waiting for me to catch up. My success rate in hunting skyrocketed. It wasn't just that he was directing me, it was that his presence cleared the competition. No other predator was stupid enough to hunt the same, ground as a massive black wolf and a two-legged creature carrying a noisy rifle. We became a seamless, weird unit. Caleb, the man the world called a thief, and the wolf, the creature the pack had abandoned. We were the outcasts running the high country. The biggest challenge was keeping him hidden. He was too large, too noticeable, and too valuable to risk exposure. Every time we heard a plane overhead or saw evidence of snowmobilers miles down the valley, the anxiety flared up. The world hadn't forgotten the wilderness. It was just waiting for the spring thaw to come and stake its claim. I taught the wolf commands, not with harsh training, but through repetition and reward. He never learned sit or stay. Those were beneath him, but he learned hush, meaning to silence a low growl when strangers were near, and home, meaning to retreat immediately to the cabin. He understood the danger of discovery. He knew the difference between the scent of an elk and the scent of a human wearing manufactured clothes and chemicals, and he treated the latter with cautious contempt. One afternoon, in late March, we were scouting a new ridge where the snow was starting to melt, revealing patches of brown earth. The wolf was about 50 yards ahead, sniffing along a rocky outcrop. I was following, enjoying the slightly warmer air and the promise of spring. Suddenly, he stopped, freezing mid-step. His body went rigid, and his hackles, the fur along his spine, stood straight up, making him look twice his size. He didn't make a sound, but the tension radiating off him was palpable. I stopped instantly, dropping into a firing stance, scanning the woods. I smelled nothing, heard nothing, but I trusted him completely. He turned his head slowly, looking back at me, his amber eyes wide. He wasn't signaling game, he was signaling danger. I crept up to the outcrop, rifle raised. "What is it, Shadow? Bear?" He shifted his gaze, pointing his nose not into the trees, but toward the ground near his paws. I looked down. There, barely visible beneath a thin layer of melting snow, was a small plastic flagging tape, the kind surveyors use, and next to it, a small laminated paper tag, anchored by a rock. I knelt and brushed the snow away. The tag wasn't from a surveyor, it was a metal tag, stamped with the letters USFS, U.S. Forest Service, and a specific number. It was a boundary marker, but a new one. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. The Forest Service was miles away from my remote plot. They didn't come up here unless they had a reason. I looked around frantically. Sure enough, tucked into the crevice of the granite outcrop, I found a small, discreet trail camera, cleverly hidden to blend with the moss and rock. Someone was watching this land. Someone was mapping it, and they were getting closer to my cabin. I quickly ripped the camera off the rock, pulling the memory card out. I crushed the card under the heel of my boot until it was nothing but plastic shards. Home, Shadow. Now. We moved back to the cabin with a speed and urgency we hadn't needed since his injury. My mind was racing. Why was the Forest Service suddenly interested? Were they expanding the protected areas? Or was this something else? I couldn't shake the feeling that my past was finally catching up to me. The news reports might have faded, but the legal framework, the warrants, the people who lost money, they didn't forget. They just waited for an opportunity. Back in the cabin, I paced while the wolf watched me from his corner. I felt the old panic returning, the suffocating fear of being exposed and judged. "They're coming, partner," I muttered, running a hand over the rough wood of the rifle stock. "They found the edge of the line. They're going to keep pushing." I had to be ready. I spent the next few days fortifying the cabin. I boarded up the few weak windows I had, reinforced the door with heavy crossbeams, and, most importantly, I moved my entire dried food cache from the shed into the main cabin, hiding it beneath the floorboards. I wasn't just preparing for winter anymore, I was preparing for a siege. The wolf stayed close, sensing the shift in my mood. He was restless, pacing the length of the cabin, his low growl a constant, vibrating sound in the small space. He knew the scent of trouble, and he knew it was near. The real test came a week later, not from the Forest Service, but from the wilderness itself. It was a cold, sunny morning, one of those days that promises spring but delivers frostbite. I was outside, splitting a massive pile of pine I'd hauled down the slope, building up my final reserve before the thaw. The wolf was lying about 20 feet away, soaking up the weak sun, seemingly dozing. I was mid-swing with the splitting maul when the air changed. It wasn't a sound, it was an absence of sound. The chirping of the chickadees stopped dead. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Before I could even register the silence, the wolf was up. He didn't bark, he didn't whine. He launched himself forward, placing his massive body squarely between me and the dense pine forest line, letting out a deep, resonant roar that was pure warning, pure fury. I dropped the maul and spun around, grabbing the rifle that was leaning against the woodpile. And then I saw it. It was a grizzly bear, a huge boar, easily 500 pounds, lean and mean after a long hibernation. It had emerged early, driven by a desperate, starving hunger. It was standing upright, maybe 30 feet away, its massive head raised, sniffing the strong scent of the dried venison I had stored in the shed near the cabin entrance. A grizzly is not a mountain lion. A grizzly is a tank. It doesn't fight for territory, it fights to eat, and a hungry one is the most dangerous thing in North America. The bear saw the wolf. It paused, momentarily surprised by the black guardian. Grizzlies usually avoid wolves, but this one was too desperate. It lowered its head and let out a guttural, rattling sound, a challenge. The wolf didn't back down. He took a single, aggressive step forward, planting his feet firmly in the snow, and let out a second, even louder challenge. It wasn't a wolf howl. It was a guttural snarl of absolute protective rage. This wasn't a fight for survival. This was a defense of home. I knew I had only seconds. If the bear charged, my rifle shot had to be perfect or we were both dead. I raised the rifle, aiming for the center mass, knowing a headshot was too risky if the bear was moving. "Shadow, back, home," I yelled, my voice cracking from the adrenaline. The wolf hesitated, looking back at me for a split second, his eyes blazing with the primal need to defend. But he obeyed. He knew the drill. He dropped low and circled back toward the cabin door, keeping his body between the bear and me, a living shield. The bear took that movement as its opening. It dropped onto all fours and charged, covering the distance to the woodpile in 3 massive bounds. I fired. The sound was deafening. The .30-06 round hit the bear high in the shoulder, spinning it slightly but not stopping the momentum. It let out a roar of pain and fury, a sound that shook the ice off the trees. It was coming right for me. Before I could cycle the bolt for a second shot, the wolf launched himself. It was a move of pure, calculated instinct. He didn't go for the throat or the legs. He darted in low, snapping viciously at the bear's exposed, wounded shoulder, aiming to maximize the pain and confusion. The bear roared, swiping blindly with a paw that could have crushed my skull. The wolf dodged, moving like water, harassing the larger predator, a black, furious ghost dancing around the grizzly's massive bulk. I cycled the bolt, my hands shaking, trying to find a clean shot without hitting the wolf. The two animals were a churning, snarling blur of fur and muscle. "Get out of the way, Shadow." The wolf drove in again, biting hard at the bear's flank, drawing blood. This wasn't about winning, it was about distraction. He was buying me time. The bear finally managed to catch the wolf with a glancing blow from its forearm, sending the black shape tumbling several feet through the snow. The wolf landed hard, letting out a surprised yelp, but he was instantly back on his feet, though favoring his healed leg slightly. The bear turned its attention back to me, seeing the opportunity. It charged again, this time focused entirely on the man with the fire stick. This was my shot. I settled the crosshairs just above the bear's chest, compensating for the upward angle of the charge. Boom! The second shot hit true, driving deep into the bear's vitals. It stumbled, letting out a horrible bubbling cough, and then collapsed heavily into the snow, sliding to a stop just 10 feet from the woodpile. It thrashed once, shuddered, and was still. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood there, breathing heavily, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. My heart felt like it was going to punch through my ribs. I lowered the rifle slowly. I looked at the dead bear, then I looked at the wolf. He was standing perfectly still, his body low, his fur bristling, watching the massive carcass. He was breathing heavily, a fine film of blood, not his own, on his muzzle. He was hurt, maybe, but alive. I walked over to him, dropping the rifle into the snow. I didn't care about the bear, the meat, or the danger anymore. I just wanted to check him. I knelt down, running my hands quickly over his shoulders and flanks, searching for breaks or serious cuts. He flinched at my touch, but didn't pull away. "You idiot," I whispered, pulling his head close to mine, burying my face in his thick, warm fur. "You absolute idiot. You should have run." He let out a low, vibrating sound, a mix between a growl and a purr, and pushed his heavy head against my chest. He hadn't run. He had defended me. He had chosen to stand against a mortal enemy, not for food, but for the safety of our shared space. He had put his life on the line for the man who saved him. In that moment, standing over the massive, steaming carcass of a grizzly bear, I realized the full extent of our bond. He wasn't just my companion. He was my family. The only family I had left. The world had thrown me away because they thought I was a monster. But here, in the eyes of a true predator, I was seen as worthy of protection. I spent the rest of the day butchering the bear, a grim, necessary task. It was a massive amount of meat, enough to last us through the rest of the harsh winter and into the spring thaw. The wolf stayed close, watching, occasionally licking the snow to clean the blood from his paws. As the sun went down, painting, the sky in colors too beautiful for the violence of the day, I sat by the wood stove, utterly exhausted, the cabin smelling strongly of bear fat and pine smoke. I looked at the wolf, who was curled up on his canvas, resting deeply, occasionally twitching his ears. "We need a better system," I murmured, staring into the flames. "We need to know when they're coming before they get to the door, whether they have 4 legs or 2. The thought of the camera I destroyed came back to me. The world outside was encroaching. The tourists, the surveyors, the potential law enforcement. They were like the grizzly. They would keep pushing until they broke through. I realized I couldn't rely solely on the wolf's senses or my rifle. I needed to use the skills I had brought with me from the city, the ones I had tried so hard to forget. Before the fire, before the fall, I was known for being meticulous, for seeing patterns where others saw chaos. I was good at logistics, good at planning, and good at anticipating threats. That was the man they hated. But out here, those skills weren't about greed or betrayal. They were about survival. I pulled out my old, heavy notebook, the one I used to track my food stores and weather patterns, and flipped to a clean page. I started drawing. I drew maps of my property, marking the best routes of approach, the hidden ravines and the blind spots. I marked where the wind usually carried scent and where the sun hit the snow first. I devised a perimeter defense system, not fences, which would be impossible in this terrain, but a network of tripwires and subtle alarms made from fishing line and small hollow gourds I had found near the creek bed. They wouldn't hurt anyone, but they would give me a precious few minutes of warning. I was building a fortress, not just of logs and stone, but of vigilance and planning. I was using the mind of Caleb, the successful, calculating businessman, to protect the life of Caleb, the bitter mountain man, and his wild companion. The spring arrived violently, as it always does in the Bitterroots. The snow melted fast, turning the creek into a raging torrent and the trails into muddy, impassable slogs. The smell of thawing earth and wet pine filled the air. The wolf's leg was fully healed now. He moved with the effortless grace of his kind, leaping over fallen logs and traversing the muddy slopes without hesitation. He spent more time outside, ranging farther, but he always returned by nightfall, curling up right next to the wood stove, the fire his anchor. Our bond was tested again one evening when the original pack returned. I was outside, checking the perimeter alarms, when I heard the chorus of howls. They were closer than ever before, sounding like they were right on the edge of my property line. The wolf was inside the cabin. He heard them too. I rushed back inside. He was standing by the door, ears pricked, listening intently. His pack, his family, was calling him home. I braced myself. This was the moment. The pull of the pack is the strongest force in the wolf world. I had provided safety and food, but the pack provided identity. I watched him, my heart heavy, ready to say goodbye. He let out a low whine, a sound of deep conflict. He walked to the door, then stopped. He walked to the center of the cabin, looked at me, looked at the fire, and then looked back at the door. The pack howled again, a collective, powerful call demanding his return. The wolf dropped onto his haunches and responded with a howl of his own. It was a deep, resonant sound, but it wasn't a cry of reunion. It was a rejection. It was a statement. I am here. I am not coming. The pack's howls stopped abruptly. There was a moment of silence, and then slowly the howls resumed. But they were retreating, moving away down the valley. They understood. Their lost member had chosen a new allegiance. When the sounds faded completely, the wolf walked over to me, nudged my hand gently with his nose, and then settled back onto his canvas, seemingly satisfied. I sank onto my mattress, running a hand over his thick fur. "You chose the wrong side, partner," I whispered, smiling. "But I'm glad you did." The external threats, however, were just beginning. One morning, in late April, I found a new marker nailed to a tree, right on the boundary line I had established. It wasn't the small USFS tag, and this was a large, brightly colored sign. Notice: private property, trespassers will be prosecuted. E-survey in progress. Big Sky Development, LLC. Big Sky Development. That name hit me like a physical blow. It was the name of the company that had swallowed up my old partnership, the one run by the very people who had set me up and ruined my life in Spokane. They weren't just surveying, they were expanding. They were buying up huge tracts of land, moving their reach deeper into the wilderness. And now, they had reached my back 40. They weren't just looking for property lines, they were looking for opportunity. And if they found a small, isolated cabin owned by the man they had disgraced, they wouldn't hesitate to use every legal and illegal trick to force me out. The fear was different now. It wasn't the generalized anxiety of being caught, it was the specific, sharp dread of facing my enemies again. The people who had turned the world against me were now knocking on my door. I grabbed the sign, ripped it off the tree, and shredded it with my bare hands, the wood splintering in my fury. I looked at the wolf, who had followed me out and was watching the display of rage with calm, intense interest. "They won't leave me alone," I ground out, my voice thick with hatred. "They won't let me have this." The wolf didn't try to comfort me. He simply walked to the edge of the clearing, looked down the muddy, newly marked trail, and let out a low, menacing growl. It was a promise. He wouldn't let them have it either. I knew then that the time for hiding was over. The world I had fled was coming to claim my last refuge. We had survived the cold. We had survived the beasts. But now we had to survive the humans. And this time, I wouldn't be running. I would be waiting. We would defend our home together. They wouldn't leave me alone. That was the core truth of the whole mess, wasn't it? The world doesn't care if you retreat to the mountains. If you owe them something, be it money, reputation, or just the satisfaction of seeing you ruined, they will eventually send someone to collect. I spent the next 2 weeks implementing my defense plan. It wasn't about bullets, it was about borders. I used the old skills, the ones I used to employ analyzing financial risk, but I applied them to physical security. I rigged fishing line across the narrow game trails leading up the ridge, tying the lines to small hollow gourds that would rattle if disturbed. I placed them at different heights, knowing humans would step over the low ones, but the high ones, catching a backpack or a shoulder, would give me a silent alert. The wolf understood the new tension. He moved around the perimeter with me, sniffing the ground where I set the alarms. He knew the scent of my fear, and he recognized the pattern of preparation. He was my shadow, but now he was also my sentinel. We were waiting for the inevitable. The sign from Big Sky Development wasn't a warning, it was a declaration of war. The attack came not with a bang, but with a whine. It was mid-morning, the sun just starting to burn off the valley mist. I was inside, sharpening my axes, the wolf asleep beside the stove, when the first alarm went off. A low, distant rattle, rattle, rattle from the southeast ridge. It was faint, but unmistakable. I froze. The wolf's head snapped up, his ears swiveling instantly toward the sound. "Hush," I whispered, grabbing the rifle. "Stay low. Home." He didn't need to be told twice. He melted into the deepest shadow near the hearth, his massive body silent, his amber eyes fixed on me. I moved to the nearest window, a tiny slit I had reinforced with thick glass and a heavy shutter, and peered out. The path they would take was clear, the old rocky trail that Big Sky had just finished marking. I waited. The only sound was the frantic pounding of my own heart. A few minutes later, I saw them. Not a large crew, just 2 men, dressed in heavy-duty work clothes, carrying clipboards and GPS units. They were not surveyors. They were muscle. They moved with the aggressive confidence of people who thought they owned the mountain. The first man, a burly guy with a patchy beard, was clearly annoyed. He was picking at the fishing line I'd set up, cursing under his breath. "Stupid mountain trash," I heard him mutter, even from this distance. "Who puts up fishing line in the woods?" They walked past the first marker, then the second. They were heading directly for the cabin, looking around with open disdain. They represented everything I had hated about the city. The arrogance, the assumption of ownership, the belief that money trumped everything. I let them get within 50 feet of the cabin, right into the small open clearing where the woodpile stood. I had planned this carefully. I wasn't going to shoot them. I was going to terrify them. I raised the rifle to the window slit, not aiming at the men but at the massive, dead stump of an ancient cedar tree, strategically placed 20 feet behind them. Crack! The shot roared, splitting the air. The cedar stump exploded, showering bark and splinters into the air. The 2 men screamed, dropping their clipboards, throwing themselves flat into the muddy snow. "Get out!" I roared, pitching my voice low and guttural, trying to sound like the mountain itself was yelling. "You are on private land. Leave now." They scrambled up, eyes wide with panic, looking frantically for the source of the shot. They couldn't see me in the dark slit of the window. They just saw the gun smoke hanging in the cold air. "Let's go! Let's go!" the bearded man shrieked, scrambling back toward the trail. They started running, slipping and sliding in the spring mud. But I wasn't done yet. They needed to know this place was cursed. I had left one final critical element of defense outside, the wolf's scent. The earth around the woodpile was saturated with the smell of my hunting, the blood, and the constant presence of a massive predator. As they ran past the woodpile, I heard the man yell, "What the hell is that smell? Is that blood?" I gave the wolf the signal. Shadow. Now. He didn't rush out. He moved deliberately, slipping out the back door I had cracked open, circling around the far side of the cabin and positioning himself right on the edge of the clearing where the thick pines met the trail. Just as the 2 men reached that spot, running full out, the wolf stepped into view. He didn't charge. He just stood there, massive and black against the white snow, blocking their exit. He lowered his head, his eyes burning amber, and let out a single, earth-shaking, terrifying sound. The deep, resonant, protective roar he had used against the grizzly. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a simple growl. It was the sound of the wilderness demanding obedience. The men didn't even pause to register what they were seeing. They just saw a creature of nightmare, a huge, silent, furious black wolf blocking their path. They didn't stop to think if it was wild or tame. They didn't care. They didn't try to run around him. They turned and plunged straight down the steepest, most dangerous side of the slope, screaming like children, crashing through the brush, choosing certain injury over spending another second in the presence of that black guardian. I watched through the window as they disappeared, their frantic shouts fading into the roar of the creek below. They weren't coming back. They had been utterly broken by fear. The wolf stood there for a moment longer, surveying the empty clearing, his fur bristling with victory. Then he trotted back to the cabin door, scratched lightly, and I let him in. He walked past me, calm and collected, and settled, back down by the stove. He looked up at me, and I could have sworn there was a flicker of something like amusement in his eyes. "We won, partner," I whispered, the relief making my voice shake. "We sent them packing." I spent the next hour cleaning the rifle and settling my nerves. I knew that Big Sky Development wouldn't send those guys back. They would send lawyers, maybe, or police, but the message had been sent. This land is defended by something that doesn't obey their rules or respect their money. The incident was reported, I'm sure of it. 2 terrified men claiming they were shot at by a maniac who keeps a monster wolf as a guard dog. But up here, those kinds of stories just become local legends, rumors that keep the curious away. They needed proof, they needed a body, and they needed a way to get past the wolf and the old man with the rifle. They never tried again. The weeks turned into months. The spring thaw came and went, replaced by the deep green of summer. My garden flourished, the creek provided endless cold water, and the woods were full of game. Life settled into a profound, shared rhythm. We were no longer just surviving. We were thriving. I still went into the woods daily, but now I rarely carried the rifle for protection. I carried it for hunting, and the wolf carried the true defense. We were a unit, moving through the high country with the silent authority of true inhabitants. Sometimes, when we were resting on a high ridge, looking out over the endless green expanse of the Bitterroots, I would reach out and scratch the wolf behind his ears. He would lean into my touch, a massive, comforting weight against my side. I had lost everything back in the city, my reputation, my friends, my future, but up here, I had found something infinitely more valuable: honesty. The honesty of the wilderness, and the honesty of a relationship built on mutual necessity and unshakable trust. The world had turned its back on Caleb, the man they called a cheat. But the wilderness hadn't. It had given me a place, a purpose, and a partner. I was still an outcast, sure, but I wasn't alone. I was here with the wolf, the shadow, the only creature who saw me not for the lies the world told, but for the man I truly was. A survivor willing to fight for his home. And as long as the sun rose over the Bitterroots, and as long as the wolf was by my side, I knew I was exactly where I belonged. This was home. And we were safe. We were finally free.